You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you.
We talk a lot about created kinds,
Oh boy, yeah.
or baramins.
Yeah.
You know, we kind of throw this terminology around a lot. But what does it really mean? That wasn't a play on words, by the way. What does it? What is a created kind anyway? That's basically the question I'm asking. What is a created kind?
What does it mean? So, for the rest of you out there wondering where we're laughing at, mean is the Hebrew word that's translated in the English Bible as kind. So, what does it mean as a created kind? Oh goodness. That's a hard question. And we often get criticized for this. And I think it's rather odd the way it's approached. So I've heard people say, you have to give me a formal definition for exactly what it is. And I give them one, and then they just act like that's not good enough. Which, okay, fair enough. Other times I've heard people tell me, you know, until you give me a list of all the created kinds, then there's no point in even talking about it, which I think, well, that's odd. How do we find all the created kinds if we can't talk about and work on it? So it's a funny thing, but okay. So a created kind, the idea came out of studies of species, I guess is the best way to talk about it. So back in the, say, high Middle Ages, just before, say, the Reformation and Columbus voyage and so forth, there were all manner of ideas about how organisms propagated themselves, right? So there was still going around the story that if you had rotten meat and you left it out, it would make flies from the meat. And this was, spontaneous generation. And so these ideas were believed. There were even things that were, recipes for how to make mice. Put your sweaty clothes in a place and make sure it's dark, and then mice will come out of them or something. And and I think it's part of that because people would uncover these mouse nests in their whatever and think, oh, this is where the mice came from. But after a while, people began to, with the scientific revolution, people began to study where critters come from and where animals and plants come from. And in doing so, they would find, okay, well, it's not true. This was sort of a really a milestone in biological science, was finding out that no, in fact, rotting meat does not produce flies. Rotting meat will rot by itself, and the flies are hatched from eggs that are laid on the meat. And this was demonstrated by an Italian guy named Francesco Redi, and it was done in the 1600s. And from there, basically everybody got this idea that, well, if animals come from mommy and daddy animals that are of the same type, then that just goes all the way back to God, right? That just goes all the way back to their origin in, creation week. So that was one idea that was influential in this development of the created kind. The other idea from it comes from studies of species. And so people who began to say, all right, well, if baby animals come from mommy and daddy animals of the same sort, what is that? Well, they called that a species. And then they said, all right, well, let's list all the species. And so in that attempt to list the species, then they discover, oh, this is complicated. There are things that maybe they're good species, maybe they're not good species, and you would have disagreements. One expert would look at a group of creatures and come away with one list of species, and another expert would look at the same group of creatures and come away with a slightly different list, where they would say this version of the species, this version of the creature is a species, and the other person would say, no, it's not a species, it's part of this species, and so forth. So that led to even more study, and plant breeding became really popular especially in England in the 19th century. And so that led to a guy named William Herbert. He was a clergyman who bred amaryllis, which is a flower, right? And so he discovers, oh my goodness, you can make new what appear to be species. You can cross two things, and if you keep working at it over several generations, eventually you'll get an entirely new amaryllis with new properties that breed true. And all of that then sort of feeds into Charles Darwin's perspective on it. And Darwin just said, well, if you can make a new species by breeding, then that could happen in the natural world. And he marshaled a bunch of evidence for that as well. Now, the creationist reaction initially was to sort of just reject what Darwin had said, which basically was because, well, that's just the reaction to one extreme is always to go to the other extreme, right? I mean, if all species evolved from a common ancestor, well, then the right answer must be that no species evolved. They all were created. And eventually, in the 20th century, we had other creationists come along who knew more about species and so forth, and they were able to say, no, in fact, it looks more like there are groups of species that came out of a common created ancestral population, whatever that might be. And that over time, those species have, as they've spread out across the earth after the flood, they've adapted to local conditions, and they've generated new, what we would think of as species. So the created kind is not necessarily a species, but it can often include more than one species. Now, this is all from biology, right? This is all just working out biology and working out how that might relate to the way God describes things in Genesis. So when God creates in Genesis, he creates things after their kind. And you see that phrase repeated often in Genesis. And so that's where the idea of created kind, the terminology comes from. It comes from Genesis 1. And it also comes, you see it again during the flood narrative when Noah is told to take two of every kind aboard the ark with him, that God would bring those animals to him and that he would gather them up and put them on the ark. And so that leads to the idea that, well, maybe the ark was not full of millions of species, which is what the critics want to tell us, which is preposterous. But in fact, may have contained representatives of different created kinds that then generated new species after the flood. So it's a synthesis of what we know from biology, that we can reasonably infer and see directly in nature. And it's also putting together pieces of the puzzle, I think, from what this Bible describes about creation and what the Bible describes about the flood. So a formal definition, you might, people have suggested that if two species could interbreed, they must belong to the same created kind. That's one way to recognize one. Another might be, if you think that God creates a created kind to exhibit certain traits, and he doesn't want those traits to change, then you might imagine that a created kind has a certain underlying recognizable set of features that you could recognize, and so that leads to various other sort of conceptions of the created kind that we might use to study the fossil record. But yeah, I mean, it all basically comes back to this notion that species are not fixed, they're not permanent, and they're not, they are generated out of sort of regular biological processes that were operating after the flood. But evolution does not go on forever. It does not, it's not like all things are related to a common ancestor. So yeah, and frankly, it's very useful, and it's produced an enormous amount of research over the past 30 years that I've been involved. And, you know, it's been fossil work. People have studied the fossil record for this. People have used genetics to study created kinds. People have used anatomy to study created kinds. There are a host of different approaches to studying created kinds that I think is good. And hopefully we'll start to see some fruit. What's really interesting is when you get a lot of different conceptions and ideas about created kinds that sort of converge on a similar conclusion, which I think is very helpful in thinking about there's something to this rather than just, you know, creationist wishful thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So
just as it's not always easy to tell exactly what a species is in any particular instance, what you're saying is it's not always easy to tell exactly what a kind is, and so we have to apply multiple criteria.
Yeah.
There isn't one kind of magic bullet that can tell us what a created kind is.
That's right.
And so hopefully, you know, by applying lots of different criteria, we can sort of converge on the right answer.
Right.
And it may well be, it almost certainly isn't true, that the created kind is equivalent to one particular level in the taxonomic hierarchy. So you're saying, you know, you can have multiple species in a created kind, but the created kind could be sometimes a family, sometimes a suborder, sometimes a subfamily. You know, could be at different levels.
We've come up with different answers for different sorts of creatures too. I mean, it does not seem to be the same across the board, and the number of species in a created kind is not the same. There are some created kinds that have an enormous number of species, a surprising number that I think alarms a lot of creationists. That how could that many species be, you know, descended from a common ancestor from the flood? And yet, I would say most, based on what I know about, say, the mammals, for example, most created kinds have very few species in them, maybe half a dozen or less. So it's uneven. And you know, it's very similar to what you have with species. There are different concepts of what species are. It's not the same for all types of creatures. Species concept among bacterial people who study bacteria, not the same sort of species concepts that you would use in the fossil record, which is not the same sort of species concept that you would use out in ecology and studying organisms in their natural environment. And so just because, you know, we don't have it all perfectly pinned down right now doesn't make it any less science.
You've just heard a clip from the Let's Talk Creation podcast. If you want to check out full episodes, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And if you want to check out other streaming options, visit us at coresci.org/podcast. That's coresci.org/podcast.